Now we will hear Wouter. Critical theory, Hegel's philosophy, and recognition theory. He will present to us critical theory and the emancipatory interest, examining Honneth's grounding of critical theory. So, Wouter, you have 30 minutes to present. Then Diana Zarco will give the comments. She will have 15 minutes. And then we will have 15 minutes for questions. So, you can start.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me well like this. Okay, good. So, hi everyone, my name is Wouter. So as the introduction said, I'm a PhD student at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. First of all, I'd like to thank conference organizers for this interesting conference and for giving me the opportunity to speak here. So I will talk today about my paper. It's called Critical Theory and the Emancipatory Interest, examining Honneth's grounding of critical theory. Before I start, I guess I say a little bit about the scope of the project that I'm working on. So I am interested more generally in this question of an emancipatory interest within the tradition of critical theory, understood as the Frankfurt School critical theory, and I'm ultimately interested in developing an alternative account of how we can account for the existence of an emancipatory interest in this tradition. But in this paper that I will present today, I will not talk about a positive proposal that I might have for this, but I will merely discuss and examine Honneth's attempt of answering this question. So what I'll do today, I first have the introduction and discuss Horkheimer's original account of critical theory to make clear, discuss and make clear sort of the general problem that we are dealing with here and why this is the central and important problem in the creation of critical theory. After that, I will discuss and set out Honneth's account of critical theory and critical theory of recognition, after which I will discuss the way in which Honneth attempts to ground his critical theory in social reality, and I end by criticizing his approach, and so that critical theory has to be rethought in order to answer this fundamental question. To answer the fundamental question of how critical theory can be grounded in such reality. So, as an introduction, ever since its inception, critical theory has attempted to give an account of how individuals can achieve emancipation from oppression that is characteristic of the social world. And important methodological strategy that this tradition uses is the idea that the normative underpinnings of the tradition are to be traced to an emancipatory interest that individuals have that can be traced back to some sort of activity in social reality that is supposed to set critical theory apart from alternative approaches to social analysis that have to appeal to external sources for their normative justification. Such as maybe Rawlsian, the ideas such as maybe Rawlsian theories of justice, for example. So critical theory stands apart from such approach, and does so because of its methodology that it relies on an emancipatory interest, which must meet three conditions. It must provide a motive for action. It must provide knowledge of the state of society, so it must tell us that society is unjust and why it is unjust. And it has to provide a standard for future development of society so that society can be developed as to overcome the injustices that are characteristic of society today. So the main author that I discussed in this paper, Axel Honneth, according to him, this idea of an emancipatory interest can already be traced back to the work of Karl Marx in his famous analysis of capitalism. But as a reference point here, he used first generation critical theorist Max Horkheimer, who remaining very much indebted to philosophy of history, maintained that in the proletariat, in the working class, there was something in the activity of the working class that showed to us why society was unjust, and that society could change for the better. Now, when the second generation critical theorists under Habermas, this idea sort of shifted, and Habermas presented the idea that emancipation was to be found in structure of language, arguably, and Honneth, sort of placing Honneth within this tradition, then also had to find an answer to this question of where an emancipatory interest comes from and what provides the normative underpinnings of a critical social theory. And so in this paper, I then argue for two things. First, that Honneth attempts to ground critical theory in the idea of suffering. And second, I want to show that his attempt to do so fails because Honneth has to presuppose an interest in freedom, and thus has to presuppose a standard for developing the development of society, which he has to extract from his activity, but he cannot do so. So to start with a bit of background, Horkheimer's original formulation of critical theory. So in Horkheimer's famous essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, Max Horkheimer discusses, it makes a distinction between what you can get traditional theory and critical theory. And for Horkheimer, traditional theory is the traditional theory as you think about it normally in, for example, the natural sciences. So we have a set of propositions about a specific subject, and those propositions try to explain facts in a certain domain. And he distinguishes traditional theory from critical theory. And according to Horkheimer, critical theory, it does not mainly aim to describe facts as they are, but aims to ask the question of how society could be changed for the better. Critical theory also has a different treatment of facts than traditional theory. So on this reading, where traditional theory takes sort of facts and propositions as naturally given, critical theory treats them as a product of human activity itself, and as such, critical theory can ask the question of whether things could be different than as they are now. And this is the question that traditional theory, according to Horkheimer, cannot ask. So importantly, those different kinds of theories are related to different interests that we as individuals have, and whereas traditional theory is sort of related to an interest in the reproduction of society, or so Horkheimer argues. Critical theory is related in an interest in emancipation, so asks a different set of questions than traditional theory asks. This doesn't mean that in an emancipated society, we would not need traditional theory anymore, but without critical theory, we could not reach an emancipated society, so goes the thought. So Horkheimer himself is convinced that the aims of theories are produced by activities in social life. So like I said in the sort of introductory slide already, Horkheimer still is very much indebted to Marxist ideas of philosophy of history, and the belief in inevitability of the revolution sort of traced the activity in which critical theory could find its interest in emancipation in the working class and correspondingly the category of work or labor through which we could gain access to ideas of why society is unjust and how society must be changed for the better. So the thought is that with the sort of in the early 30s, 40s in Europe, sort of the decreasing trust in the idea that the revolution would inevitably happen, we have to look for sort of the ideas that Marxist analysis that this interest could be traced back to the category of work sort of felt less popular, and we have to find an alternative for this. So Habermas attempted to do this, as I said, in the category of language, and Honneth, my main interest in this paper, also has to answer this question. And I will now, in the rest of this talk, try to show that Honneth does so by introducing the category of suffering, and then after I've shown that, I'll argue that this approach is ultimately unsuccessful. So now that we have the background of the problem to discuss, let's turn to Honneth's critical theory of recognition. So Honneth developed a critical theory that's based on sort of broadly two central claims. First, the idea that the reproduction of social life is governed by mutual recognition because it enables one to develop a practical relation to self. And the second claim is that the normative directional change of society is determined by claims for recognition. So here already we can see that Honneth developed a theory, and that is sort of broadly also concerns with the general questions that the first generation critical theorists had also asked. So we have to examine what it means. So I will say a bit more about what Honneth's theory of recognition sort of comes down to. So first of all, Honneth developed a theory of recognition that sort of makes a distinction between three spheres in which we can and want, according to him, want to obtain recognition. So the first sphere is the sphere of love, and second is the sphere of right, and the third is the sphere of solidarity. And the idea is that in each sphere, by obtaining recognition, we can develop a specific kind of practical self-relation, namely self-confidence, self-respect, and self-esteem. And all of those self-relations are ultimately necessary to live a free, to fully achieve self-realization, form our identities, and ultimately to live a free life, as we all want to do. So freedom on Honneth's account of recognition becomes sort of defined in terms of self-realization. So we are free once we have achieved recognition in those three spheres, once we develop the three relations to self, namely self-confidence, self-respect, and self-esteem. Of course, we do not always get the recognition that we want to get, or that we think that we deserve. And Honneth recognizes this and labels such experiences in which we do not get this recognition as experiences of disrespect. And disrespect can happen in all three spheres, and the specific of how this works are slightly different, which if you're interested in, we can talk about in the Q&A, but I don't think is specifically important for the argument that I want to make, so I won't go much over the details here, but the idea is that disrespect threatens the possibility of self-realization and hence threatens the possibility of freedom. And so what does it mean that it threatens the possibility of self-realization? Well, it does so because if we don't get recognition, we can't develop the practical relations to self, which we need, so we can't achieve self-confidence, we can't achieve self-respect, etc. And if we can't do this, then the idea is that we can also not achieve freedom that we want to. So that is briefly Honneth's theory of recognition. So connecting this brief analysis of the theory of recognition with the initial question that we identified with Horkheimer, namely the question of in what activity can we ground, can we in-socialize, can we ground this critical theory so that we can have a normative advantage over alternative modes of social analysis. So Honneth must also answer Horkheimer's question, and he must ground his theory in an activity in social life. And this is a suggestion that I want to make here, is that Honneth does this by grounding his theory in the category of suffering that is caused by experiences of disrespect. So, like I said before, we have an interest, we want to achieve recognition. If we deny recognition, we experience disrespect, and this disrespect leads to a specific form of suffering. And this suffering, though it's maybe not properly thought of as, though suffering is probably not properly thought of as an activity, it takes the role of the activity that we are looking for in this sort of broadly critical theory framework. So the idea is that suffering takes the function of this activity, so that suffering provides normative and aesthetic basis of critical theory. So and suffering is brought about by the experience of being disrespected. So yeah, what I said, so suffering has the same role in Honneth's theory as it has in the work of Horkheimer, but it's unclear what the concept of exactly looks like in his theory. So this is interpretative remark, which I will mention here, but which I also won't go into too much detail about. So there are three interpretations of what it means to suffer, or on Honneth's account. First one is treating suffering as a psychological concept. So if we make, as I think Honneth does in his early work, the anthropological claim that we just need to obtain recognition in those three spheres that I discussed. If we don't get recognition, then we suffer because some anthropological need that we have is violated, and that this leads to some form of psychological suffering. So in this sense, suffering is treated as a psychological concept. A second interpretation is that suffering can be caused by social disappointment. So this interpretation arises by Honneth adhering to Deweyan psychology, in which we have specific normative expectations towards society, for example, with regards to the sort of recognition that we need, and we treat this as sort of a social concept. And if we don't get the recognition that we feel we need or what we want, then we sort of suffer because our normative expectations are disappointed, and this does not require steps to make strong anthropological claims about psychological claims, but we can nevertheless speak of suffering because we speak of a sort of frustration of a social need that we have. And then the third one is that suffering sort of expresses itself as an ultimate source for social struggles that are characteristic of characterized society, but then those struggles remain necessary to sort of get epistemic access to what it means to develop or move towards a more just society, or to move towards the knowledge that we need to have to be able to move towards a just society. So my idea has been that Honneth's theory crucially depends on experiences of suffering. And I think this is true regardless of the interpretations that we have. So that's why I don't want to make an argument about what I think the best reading of Honneth is. I think but generally it's true that Honneth's theory depends on the experience of suffering, and struggles that follow from suffering rely sort of on a kind of knowledge that can only be gained from that suffering. So so the idea that suffering gives access to this emancipatory interest that we have, and then it's traceable to something in some idea in social reality, because this suffering occurs as a result of actual demands for recognition and of recognition that individuals have. So then sort of the final part of my talk today. So I've seen that critical theory depends on the existence of an emancipatory interest. We've seen that Honneth develops a critical theory of recognition that relies on a link to suffering. So the question is Honneth successful in grounding his critical theory in an account of suffering? So you can recall the three sort of requirements of an emancipatory interest I started this talk with. So the first is emancipatory interest suffering must provide a motive for action. It must provide knowledge about the state of society, and it must provide a standard for future development of society. Very broadly, we can see that suffering can provide a motive for action. So the idea is that Honneth takes from view that individuals cannot be indifferent to sort of negative reactions that we have. So if we experience disrespect, if we're humiliated in our identity, then we cannot be indifferent towards humiliation. So we want to, so we ultimately will want to resist this disrespect. Provide the knowledge about the state of society. Well, this is apparently possible because if we suffer, then it will be to some extent transparent to individuals, but it is the case because some demands for recognition is violated. And as such, Honneth thinks suffering can provide knowledge. And third, it can also provide the standard of future development for society. So the crucial requirement that we have seen that it's the question for critical theory is if the society can be transformed and changed for the better, then we need to have a standard that we can extract from this activity. And why is this the case? Because that is what sets critical theory methodologically apart from other kinds of social analysis. So I think that all three of these requirements ultimately can be challenged. But in this talk, now in the remainder, I will mainly talk about the third requirement. So question that suffering can provide as a standard for future development of society. So to see this, the idea is that not all instances of suffering that we find in society will point to our greater freedom. And also not all instances of suffering will have the aim of increasing freedom. So we can think of a whole range of struggles that people engage in, and of suffering that we find in social reality. And we need then the question that we need to ask is for which struggles or which kind of suffering do we want to allow to happen, or we think are justified. And we need a standard to decide about which instances of suffering are justified and which ones are not. So in the sense of suffering, which instances of suffering actually point towards greater freedom and which do not point towards greater freedom. And this is a deep problem for Honneth and for critical theory, and it's the same problems that sort of plague Horkheimer's account and the Horkheimer's account. So my idea is that suffering in itself does not disclose anything specific for us what we need here to to make this, to get such a standard to make this decision about what points for greater freedom and what the category of suffering is too broad to do this, and even is too broad to do it if we think of suffering only the relevant cases of suffering as being limited to suffering as a result of disrespect. If you want to privilege a specific instance of suffering, this requires that we presuppose desire of freedom, or if we presuppose a definition of what it means to be free. But this is something that we methodologically cannot do, because this standard would have to come from this category of suffering itself, and this is something that I show is not possible. So if not all instances of suffering leads to freedom, we need standards that distinguish between specific instances of suffering, and this standard will ultimately has to be, my aim has to be presupposed, cannot be extracted from the category of suffering in the way that Honneth needs. So sort of to illustrate this point further, we can discuss cases of recognition in which that is ideological or incomplete. So it's not clear that if in cases of ideological recognition, it's not clear that individuals suffer at all. And why is it the case? Because if the sort of ideological recognition schemes also influence the kinds of demands for recognition that individuals will pose. And if that is the case, then it seems to be that even under ideological recognition schemes, there is some sort of identity formation or some sort of self-respect or that can be obtained under this. So it is not obvious that individuals will really suffer in the way that we would need here. And there are cases in which recognition functions ideologically. So if we want to ground critical theory in the category of suffering, we have seen that we have to get from the suffering, from the category of suffering itself, we have to get a standard from that category to determine which kinds of recognition or demands for recognition are justified and which ones are not, and which schemes of recognition are ideological and which ones are not. And this is something that we cannot obtain from the category of suffering alone. And I say that this is indeed a fundamental problem for Honneth's critical theory, because if the immanent standard of development cannot be extracted from the idea of recognition of suffering, then critical theory threatens to lose its advantage over other forms of analysis and threatens to form it threatens to lose its emancipatory potential. So that was all I have to say today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Wouter. Now we will hear Diana Zarco's comments. So, yeah.
Buenas tardes, buenos días a todos y a todas. No sé si se escucha bien. Solo quería compartirles que mi preparación, bueno, lo que voy a exponer, la réplica, la hice en español. En la mañana le comentaba a Donovan que no tenía ni idea que la réplica era en inglés, me disculpo. No sé cómo podría ser ahí el vínculo de la comunicación. Expongo la réplica, ustedes me... ¿Hola?
Sí, pues sí, exponla en español y ahorita vemos si puede hacer alguien una traducción de lo que vayas a decir.
Ok, perfecto.
¿Sí?
De todas formas, no voy a tardar mucho, voy a tratar como de explicar cosas muy precisas y pues para que pueda haber un espacio igual también para la traducción y las preguntas. Primero quiero agradecer... Sí, diga.
Perdón, quizá deberíamos decirle a Wouter que va a ser en español, solo para que sepa ahorita.
Okay.
So, Wouter, Diana prepared her comments in Spanish. So she will give her comments, and then one of us will try to give you a translation of those comments. So sorry, there was kind of a miscommunication there, but don't worry, we will try to give you all the comments from Diana.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Primero quiero agradecer al comité organizador por esta invitación. Para mí es un honor participar en esta actividad académica. También quiero extender un agradecimiento muy especial al doctor Donovan Hernández por considerarme en este proyecto, y gracias a todos los que están presentes. Finalmente agradezco al ponente Wouter Wiersma por el artículo. Personalmente la lectura del mismo me llevó a profundizar los conceptos que necesitaba sistematizar. Por esta razón, mi réplica consiste en exponer lo que ya de suyo está explícito en la ponencia de Wouter, pero desde una perspectiva ética que nos conduzca a una libertad como legitimación. Es decir, Wouter señala en el artículo que el sufrimiento es una manifestación de la falta de respeto, pero en términos de legitimidad, trataré de explicar que el sufrimiento por indeterminación surge por la imposibilidad de ejercer la libertad como autodeterminación del sujeto. Del libro Patologías de la Libertad de Axel Honneth extraigo los elementos para el desarrollo de esta réplica, porque se explica de una forma muy sucinta que Honneth extrae de la filosofía del derecho lo que es imprescindible para comprender la construcción teórica de Axel Honneth. A partir de la filosofía del derecho, Honneth hace una reconstrucción teórica con las condiciones sociales que posibilitan la libertad como autodeterminación del individuo, a través de 3 esferas cada vez más complejas, como son la familia, la sociedad civil y el Estado. En ello se desarrolla un aspecto de personalidad del sujeto, el amor y la autoconfianza en la familia, derechos y autorrespeto en la sociedad civil, y la valoración social en el Estado. Y la ausencia de cualquiera de ellas provoca un hueco psicológico que exige el reconocimiento. En la primera esfera está la familia. En ella el sujeto ejerce la libertad personal, se poseen los bienes y los derechos más básicos. La segunda esfera es la sociedad civil. Aquí la voluntad de los sujetos encuentra su plenitud en la contingencia de su preferencia, a través del derecho abstracto y la libertad moral. Únicamente se garantizan las condiciones finitas de la primera esfera, porque consiste en elegir entre 2 inclinaciones dadas. Sin embargo, cuando el individuo rige sus acciones únicamente mediante el sentido moral y el derecho abstracto, su libertad está condicionada por la finitud. ¿Por qué? Porque lo que está contenido en el albedrío no está determinado por la naturaleza de mi voluntad, sino por la contingencia. Por tanto, soy dependiente de ese contenido. Esta dependencia a lo contingente no solo condiciona la libertad propia, sino que también puede condicionar la libertad de otro. Por esta razón es imprescindible pasar a una tercera esfera. Honneth ahí es donde propone una tercera esfera donde la voluntad no esté solo ligada a una coacción externa, sino al bien común. Esta esfera es la eticidad y tiene la posibilidad de ordenar una sociedad libre que ofrezca a los sujetos los elementos que le permitan una autodeterminación. Para ello es necesario ubicar la libertad y la voluntad como elementos básicos para esta autodeterminación del sujeto. Hegel distingue 3 tipos de libertades. Existe la autodeterminación individual, concebida como la capacidad que tienen los seres humanos de distanciarse mediante una fuerza de decisión voluntaria de las necesidades, los deseos o los impulsos. Aunque estas pueden tener una restricción del yo, el resultado es una inacción. Otro tipo de libertad individual se da según el patrón de una decisión racional por un determinado contenido que propone metas a la acción. Sin embargo, hace falta pasar a un ámbito donde la voluntad salga de sí misma para enlazarse a otra voluntad en un ejercicio libre. Esta voluntad que sale de sí misma, Hegel la nombra como libre voluntad, que es estar consigo mismo en el otro, lo otro de sí mismo, es decir, que el sujeto identifica en el otro una extensión de sí mismo. Y para que esto sea posible, el individuo crea condiciones jurídicas y sociales que le permiten restringir su voluntad como condición de posibilidad de una verdadera expresión de la misma en las realidades objetivas del mundo. Para Hegel, esta voluntad libre es la máxima expresión del espíritu objetivo en el mundo de las condiciones sociales. Y para Axel Honneth es condición de posibilidad para la autodeterminación del sujeto. Para ello es importante pensar la voluntad como una relación reflexiva en sí misma y por consiguiente puede actuar como voluntad sobre sí misma. Es una voluntad que se tiene a sí misma como objeto, ejerce su volición sobre sí misma, esto es, tiene que ser capaz de convertir por su parte los impulsos finitos que pueden ser pensados como libres, los tiene que pensar como no finitos. La amistad y el amor son un ejemplo de determinación sin sentirse determinado, porque se considera al otro con el sentimiento de sí mismo. En Hegel, la voluntad no está vinculada a algo limitado, sino que tiene que ir más allá, porque su naturaleza no tiene vinculación a la finitud. La libertad quiere algo determinado, sí, pero en esa determinación estar cabe sí, y regresa de nuevo a lo universal como autodeterminación. Así, la voluntad es caber sí mismo en el otro, de tal modo que la libertad solo es posible si el objeto mismo de la necesidad o de la inclinación posee la cualidad de ser libre, porque solo semejante otro permite que la voluntad ejerza la experiencia de la voluntad. Esto es importante porque un sujeto puede gozar de las garantías dadas en las dos primeras esferas, pero si su libertad individual no trasciende a la voluntad libre, sufre entonces de indeterminación. Por eso Hegel afirma, la libre voluntad es aquella que quiere como voluntad libre, porque la voluntad sabe su querer y quiere su querer. El derecho es el reino de la libertad realizada y la existencia de la voluntad libre. De tal modo que si el individuo no tiene estas condiciones de autodeterminación, entonces sufre de indeterminación y busca mediante el reconocimiento, que para Hegel el reconocimiento es legitimación, perpetuar el sentido de su vida en la sociedad como un ser racional. Este sufrimiento de indeterminación provoca patologías sociales. Para Hegel, en su tiempo, él las identifica como soledad, vaciedad o abatimiento, porque el sujeto no encuentra fuera de sí una extensión de sí mismo, es decir, como la voluntad libre no haya ese otro libre, se da un retorno infinito hacia sí mismo. Ese tránsito a la eticidad tiene que ser experimentado por el sujeto individual como una liberación que lo hace volver a la realidad. De este modo, concluyo, el sufrimiento por indeterminación surge por la imposibilidad de ejercer la libertad como autodeterminación del sujeto. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Diana. Ok. Entonces me sugieren que después de la réplica pasemos directamente a las preguntas. So we will go directly to the questions, and if you would like, Diana, you can send your comments to Wouter so he can read them. That's what the organizers are advising me. So are there any questions now? You can raise your hand or write in the chat to let me know. Okay. Okay, I think no one has any questions. So I do have one question, if that's okay. I mean, since I am this is like a first approximation for me to this subject. So I just wanted to ask you about whether this notion of suffering is like strictly social, or I mean, if I understood you well, you said something like, well, this notion of suffering is more broad to, you know, to be used in this sense that Honneth would like. So are you thinking that suffering also like involves some like deeply personal experiences that are not really related to what Honneth is thinking, maybe? Like suffering is not only social or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, my idea when I say that suffering is too broad is that I think that of there are cases of suffering that Honneth would need in order to be able to answer this question is a very specific kind of suffering that maybe is related to suffering, which is maybe a shared sort of experience of like a group or that multiple people share, but that we can find many more instances of suffering. So like you say like it might also be some individual person who suffers from a specific thing, or there might be individual things, which can be very real instances of suffering, right? So not to deny this, but that is not the kind of thing that we are interested in for this theory. So in that sense, I think when I say that it's too broad of a category, I think what I have in mind is this, that there are also instances included in the idea of suffering that are not relevant for obtaining this sort of action. So an example of this could very well be indeed like individual experiences of suffering, for example, yeah, like you said. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so if there are no further questions, I think we can end this here. Is that okay? Or I don't know, maybe if someone has any other comments, it doesn't need to be a question, right? Okay, well, thank you very much, Wouter, and thank you, Diana.
Thank you.
Thank you.